For your viewing pleasure this Boxing Day, if you happen to be watching on the day that this goes up, I thought I would take a bit of a trip down memory lane. I'm going to be putting together a tier list of every watch that I've personally reviewed on the channel. To be clear, I'm talking watches that I've bought with my own money, worn and reviewed. Not every model that I've ever discussed. That would truly be a huge and unwieldy list at this point. I'd also point out that not only have I sold on a lot of these watches in order to buy others, I've lost a fair amount of money doing so. So just a word of caution there, and please don't think that this is some sort of show of wealth. It's actually quite the opposite. Other watches I have purely bought for the sake of review, as this isn't a big enough channel to have any deals with brands and so on. You can be assured then that the investments were my own, as are my losses, and indeed opinions. I think this is a good time to do a video like this, not only because it's getting towards the end of the first full calendar year for the channel, but also because I've actually made so many videos now that at this point I'm running out of space and need to start using external hard drives to store footage, so it will become hard for me to locate files in 2025. At any rate, that is something for me to worry myself with and not you. So let's have a look at the ranking system that I'm going to employ for the video. I'm going to use a fairly standard grading system, but I want to explain what I mean when I assign a watch to each category. At S rank, these are the best watches that I own. I wear them all the time and would never sell them under any circumstances. I would happily recommend them to anyone. These are still great watches that get a little less wrist time than those in S rank. I would still be happy to recommend them to others, but it might be that there's some sentimental value that these watches have for me that mean I rank them so highly, but others might not. These are good watches, ones that I would recommend to others in most cases, but there might be some pros and cons to the model that I feel mean that I don't think they'd work for everybody. These are average watches, just ones that I don't necessarily rate, but also don't hate. They are fine. I could recommend them for particular use case scenarios. For me in this band, it might be that another colorway or model would have been preferable. I might have enjoyed my time with the watch, but I can see reasons why other people might not. These are below average watches in my view. That doesn't mean that they're bad. They might be very good for a specific use case scenario, but for me personally, it might not be a case of liking them, but at least they taught me something along the way. My personal experience with these watches wasn't great. I don't think that these are necessarily a complete write-off, as of course experiences will vary, but all I can say is that mine wasn't good. Avoid at all costs. Now, before we start, I will say that the wisdom of time does mean that I now view some of these watches differently than when I first discussed them on the channel. I think that is perfectly natural. So if you think of each segment as a mini few years on wrist reflection, you'll get the idea. With all that said, let's get into the video. I'm putting this model into C tier, but I don't really want to. I love the 70s design language of this model and what it represents as a reproduction of the first ever Seiko 5 Sports. However, the period correct pressure bezel that feels awful to use when you aren't diving, and the hair ripping bracelet are both reasons why I just can't justify putting it any higher on the list. As far as value for money goes, I think the Field Medic 2 is a solid proposition, especially if you buy one during a sale period. A Mecha Quartz powered chronograph in a titanium case for less than $200 is good value, and I think this has its own unique design language too. The one drawback from me on this one is the oversized crown. Not a deal breaker, but I think it might be something that's enough to put people off. I love the aesthetic of the Devil Diver, but even this smaller variant of the Oceanographer is just too big for me. It's a shame because I would love to get the GMT version in my collection, but this range is too wide and too thick for me. I don't mind personally, but I also know that the stubby hands are also off-putting for some people. If this was a tier list of dials, the Northport would be a lot higher up in my estimations. It punches well beyond its weight with its ripple gradient dial, which just screams summer day at the beach. There's nothing actually too wrong with this watch. I think this alongside the Devil Diver just teach me that actually 200 metered divers on a budget are not what I should be buying. At the time I got this, I was really enamored with the model and totally on board with a lot of the online reviews that gushed about its value for money and movement. I do still agree that this watch looks incredible, but its on-wrist experience is too reflective and the micro rotor sounds like a kid's toy. It just has so much rattle to it. I think that I would still own this watch if I had put my hands in my pocket a little deeper and bought one of the more unique colorways that this range is famous for offering. I wouldn't rule out buying a more dynamic colorway in the future, and this ranking would change dramatically as a result. This black and purple variant just doesn't do enough on wrist to warrant the price tag for me. This is easily my favorite dial in my collection, but it isn't a watch that I actually wear all that often, hence the inclusion in the A tier. I love the watch not just for how it looks, but also because it completely opened my eyes to JDM models, and believe me, I've spent a lot of time researching them ever since. I sold almost my entire childhood Pokemon card collection to be able to buy this watch. It's also the first time I ever bought anything through bidding on eBay, and I think that rush of adrenaline is something I won't forget in a hurry. This is easily the most accurate watch that I own, and what I use to set all my others by. Now, this ranking might seem a little unfair. This watch actually made me appreciate the quality and value for money on offer from San Martin. The reason it's ranked so low though is because of the hands. I don't mind the busy dial and bezel aesthetic, but the hands are all so similar it actually makes the functionality of the watch more complicated to read than it should be. With a more distinct world timer hand, I would have ranked this much higher. I sold my first edition Portuguese base set Charizard that I packed while on holiday as a child to be able to buy this watch, and I don't regret it at all. It is big and bulky like some other models I've ranked lower down, it's true, but for me this is strictly a weekend only watch, and I guess I'm giving it a pass for sentimentality. Plus, it also has the most comfortable strap of any model I've ever owned. Now, full clarity here, the only reason that I'm rating this PRX so low is that I bought it almost immediately when the range launched, and since that initial release there have been a number of versions that I would go for over the one that I actually bought. I think that if you watch back over my initial video on the 12, I am quite clearly in love with it, and I still am, but just like the PRX, since my purchase there have been numerous upgrades and improvements. I would still buy a 12 in a heartbeat, it would just no longer be the one that I actually own. For the price point which it exists, I think it would be a real struggle to find a better dive watch than the Trident Pro. This is the third watch in a row that suffers from time creep though. In the couple of years that have passed since I bought mine, they have brought out so many upgrades and new colorways that I would prefer. This was the watch that started my entire collecting journey, and I'll always love it for that reason. But at the same time, I never actually wear it, hence it doesn't get a spot in S rank. To be honest, I think most of the reason I don't wear it is that I feel so protective over it. I certainly would never consider selling it. I have waxed lyrical about my love for the Cocktail Time range many times over, and this watch was a gift from my wife for our 10th wedding anniversary. But while it certainly isn't going anywhere, and I love the dial, it's also true that this doesn't go with everything, so it doesn't get as much regular wear as other pieces I own. I love a lot of the individual elements of this watch, but they don't necessarily harmonise together well into a final product. I love how thin the watch is, but this does mean that the clasp is very fiddly. I love the Adventurine dial, but the mirrored hands on top of it make reading the time painful. This is my Grail watch, something that I saved up for a long time to be able to buy, and something that also really helped inspire this channel and its focus on the budget end of the market. In watch terms, this wasn't actually that expensive, but for me personally, I would never feel confident spending this much on a watch again. I think this average ranking might be a little controversial, so let me explain. I have a lot of respect for the Khaki field range. I think they're well made, well proportioned, competitively priced, and a great entry point into watch collecting. The thing is, they just don't really inspire any excitement in me in the way that other models do. The Swordfish is a watch that really makes me want to be able to pull off bigger, chunkier pieces, but sadly I can't. Hence the lower ranking here. It did open my eyes to Zelos as a brand though, and there are a few smaller pieces from them recently that I've had my eye on. I really love the military utilitarian aesthetic of the GPQ. I also love the tritium tubes and function over form design. A general purpose mechanical is definitely on my hit list for the future. Now, I have heard varying opinions on this watch, some very positive, but I had quality control problems with mine. It was downright uncomfortable, with the bracelet pulling hair and the case having sharp edges that would catch on skin and clothing. I fully admit to getting caught up in the hype with these. I had the Earth and Jupiter models, and I do think they are overpriced for what they offer in reality. Even if they look great, you shouldn't be paying north of $250 for the looks alone. They did inspire me to get the real deal though, and for that I still appreciate them. I remember being unbelievably jealous of a lad in primary school who had one of these. To me, at the time, it was one of the coolest things ever, up there with the Mega Drive and the Game Boy. It's weird to imagine getting excited over a calculator now, but there you have it. Still iconic in my opinion. The video I made about this watch was actually all about how close it was to being good and what needed to change with the model to improve its aesthetics. Perhaps unsurprising then, given that feedback, that it features lower down in the rankings for me. I had to send this watch back immediately as the quality control on mine was appalling. I fully recognise that other people will have had much better experiences, but waiting 3 weeks for a product to arrive just to have to send it straight back is something that tends to leave a lasting impression. Pagani design went up massively in my estimations as a result of this watch. I was amazed at the value for money on offer, and this model is part of the reason why I don't rate the Moonswatch at all anymore. This was the final push I needed to go out and get the real deal. If this was a discussion of the Pro Diver 1953, I think this watch would feature much higher on the list. What this particular model represents for me is a really strong value for money offering for an automatic beater, as I happen to get mine for absolute peanuts. But I would definitely prefer a different colourway. This watch does actually have quite a bit of sentimental value for me, as I wore it a lot as a test bed for my Datejust. It boasts a pretty strong spec sheet for the low outlay to buy one too, but I wouldn't dare rank it any higher as I'm not remotely a fan of that palm leaf dial. I think I would rank this watch higher if it were purely based on having the movement to look at, but as a watch it was too big, too heavy and too noisy to stay in the collection. Not only that, but the dial is pretty gaudy. There are far better Chinese tourbillons out there than this one. This is my project watch, which admittedly I've neglected for quite some time. The reality is the GMA models are too big for me, but I do still love the octagonal style, and there is hope for this one yet if I manage to not ruin it with mods. Up until very recently, this was my regular workout and running watch, and as a result of that, it has seen and survived a lot of wear and tear. Nothing wrong with the watch at all, but it is quite bulky, and so it wouldn't be something that I could universally recommend. This is similar to the Tourbillon, where I wanted the movement more than the watch, and so I just bought the cheapest chronograph that had it at the time. Definitely a lesson learned here, as I'm personally not a fan of the aesthetics of this one, even if I love the movement. I love this watch, so much that at one point I did actually question whether or not I was done with watch collecting, as surely I had peaked. It has been my daily wear since I got it, and no purchase since has been able to shift it from my wrist. This is easily the favourite of all my watches that I own, and I could not recommend it highly enough. It was a bit of a long journey getting the Speedmaster reduced, through Moonswatches and Paganis, to realise that really I needed to bite the bullet and buy the real thing. But I love having this in my collection. It's perhaps my second favourite behind the Black Bay. While I ranked the World Timer from San Martin quite low because of the handset, it did make me fully appreciate the hype for the brand. For me, this GMT model is something that fully realises that. I don't think it's possible to get a better budget to quality ratio than this from any brand. This was a twinkly holiday purchase for me, and while I love the Casio models, and happen to think that this one in particular is really attractive, it is just too big for me. Another watch that ranks so low because of quality control, mine stopped working entirely after less than 3 weeks of ownership. In fairness, Yema did fix the issue, but it took a couple of months of waiting to get it back. A shame really, as I do actually love the aesthetic of this piece. While I am not a fan of the coloration of the piece that I bought, or indeed the hair ripping bracelet, I ended up wearing this watch a lot as a beta, and it served me really well. I got this one as it was essentially a quarter of RRP, but I think I would have ranked this model higher with a nicer colorway. I bought this watch with the first few months worth of money that I earned from YouTube as a replacement for my Q Quartz when it started to look really worse for wear. I really wanted to love this more than I do, but it's just a bit too big and bulky, and that bezel is still kind of naff. This has become my de facto beach watch. It's got a colorway and dial that matches the vibe, it's rugged, made from recycled ocean plastic, and is so inexpensive that you wouldn't worry too much about damaging it. I really like Mondaine as a brand, and I love their aesthetic. This is just a case of buying the wrong model. I bought this entirely because it was extremely cheap at the time, without considering if I actually wanted it or not. Impulsive Watches is a good name for the channel, unfortunately. I was actually going to review my A168 on the channel, but managed to break it in hand luggage on a flight. I still wanted to try and make a video on it, but could only get my hands on this A158 while overseas. It's not bad, but it's just not as good in my opinion. I think that the World Time model is absolutely fine, perfectly functional and affordable for the asking price. It just doesn't have the same nostalgic pull for me as other Casio models. This is a neat little homage, and make no mistake about it. The issue for me personally though is that it just didn't end up with any clear use case in my collection. I do think a slightly smaller version of this would be really appealing however. I think that the F77 is a real hidden gem of 70s sports watches that often gets overlooked. Its bezel is perhaps a bit on the nose in terms of inspiration for some, but I love that dial, and this brown smoke variant is a chef's kiss. I would just say though that this won't fit all that well on narrow wrists. If I were rating the artwork, this would rank very highly. If I were rating the concept, this would rank very highly. As a watch though, it's easy to forget how flimsy Swatch models can be, and mine started to show signs of wear and tear almost immediately. I probably would have been happier keeping this in the packaging as a display piece. I think that the Casio F91W is effectively the benchmark of the horological industry, setting the standard for the minimum expected product and doing so at a very low price point. It's very much a utilitarian, does what it says on the tin model, with an iconic design language that is genuinely hard to beat. Actually, the only avoid all costs model on the whole list. While other models on here are rated subjectively based on my experiences, this is the only one that I feel is objectively abysmal. I think if this had some form of motion control to it to switch on the display, I'd happily rate it higher. Having to press a button with your other hand makes this painfully cumbersome, even if it is period correct to the original. I absolutely love this watch for its shape, its dial, and the fact that it looks like my grandfather's watch. But I haven't quite put it in S rank simply because I don't think I could recommend it to absolutely everyone. It's definitely too small for some wrists. I've kept this watch around in my collection because I'm using it a little like the F91W as a benchmark to judge other budget pieces by. I don't think it's the best looking watch ever, but it is pretty inoffensive, comes in a range of colours and packs an insane spec list for an extremely low price point. Now, I definitely would not recommend my particular watch to other people. It's essentially a little bit on the broken side, but I loved browsing for it, the aesthetic of it, and the research that it pushed me to do into the history of Orient. While I wouldn't pay full asking price for a T80, at sales prices I think they represent a fantastic alternative for people who either like the aesthetic or, like me, have essentially bought their way through the Casio back catalogue already. I think I could have ranked this even higher if I picked a punchier colourway. If it weren't for the issues with legibility, I would happily have put this watch into S rank. It's almost as if someone at Casio has put everything I want into a G-Shock together into one watch with this. I absolutely love it. This model was only just overtaken in my mind with the acquisition of my P2100 that I've just discussed. I still love this watch, but the metal case will show up scratches and wear and tear in ways that the rubber case will not. Still ranks very high for me though. Now, obviously this list is entirely subjective, based on my personal opinions, tastes and experiences with these models, but I do hope you've enjoyed the viewing experience. One thing that I find quite reassuring about going through this process is that while I am a fan of budget watches, when I do save up for something pricier, it definitely shows in terms of quality, and that is reflected in my rankings. I don't expect for a nanosecond that we will agree on all of these judgment calls, but I would love to discuss them with you in the comment section below. As I have reviewed every single one of these watches on my channel already, if you want any deeper opinion pieces, reviews or information on any of the models, each has its own dedicated video. I won't link them all in the description though, as there simply isn't the space to do so, but you can find them all on the channel. As ever, thank you for your time. If you've enjoyed what you've seen or found it informative, consider dropping the video a like and subscribing if you want to see more content like this.